Okay, so picture this. Europe, after the Roman Empire. Things are looking, well, a bit fragmented, right? Cities shrinking, maybe some knowledge fading.
A period of flux, definitely. Right. Often called the Dark Ages, though that term's debated.
Right. But then shift your gaze eastward. Think North Africa, Middle East, Central Asia. It's like, well, the sun's coming up. A different story entirely.
A really stark contrast. Because in that vast region, something incredible was starting, an era of, immense intellectual and cultural flourishing, the Islamic Golden Age.
And that's exactly what we're diving into today. We've got the sources you send over, and we're going to unpack them, really try to get to the heart of what made this period so revolutionary.
Yeah, our mission is to pull out those key insights. And the material shows it wasn't monolithic. It was this huge interconnected civilization, multi-ethnic, multilingual.
Like a crucible almost.
Exactly. A crucible for science, art, medicine, philosophy. They weren't in separate boxes. They were mixing, influencing each other. And crucially, it wasn't just about conquest. It was driven by this deep curiosity, by dialogue.
And it's not just ancient history, is it? The echoes are still around. You find them in tech, healthcare, things we might take for granted.
Absolutely. The roots run deep. This era really starts to gain momentum around the 8th century, especially with the Abbasid Caliphate.
Baghdad. Yeah.
Their new capital. It quickly became more than just a political center. It turned into this beacon of learning, of enlightenment.
So why Baghdad? What was the magic ingredient? The sources point pretty strongly towards patronage, don't they?
Oh, massively. Caliphs like Harun al-Rashid and then his son al-Mamun, they weren't just rulers paying lip service. They actively poured resources into knowledge.
They fostered this environment, where it wasn't just about tolerating scholars from different backgrounds, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Zoroastrian.
They encouraged them. They brought them together to collaborate. That diversity was seen as a strength.
And the physical heart of this was the House of Wisdom, Beit al-Hikmah.
That's it. The research describes it as this enormous complex, think library, translation center, research institute, all rolled into one. It was the nerve center.
The descriptions are amazing. Shelves packed with manuscripts from all over. Greek, Sanskrit, Syriac, Persian.
But more than just storage, it was dynamic. A huge translation movement happened there. They weren't just copying. They were studying, debating, critiquing, building on that ancient wisdom.
And this is where Arabic really cements itself as the language of scholarship for that whole vast region, right? A common intellectual tongue.
Absolutely. So, okay, why did all this happen then and there? The sources suggest a few key things lining up.
There's the religious angle, that reported saying, seek knowledge even if it takes you to China. That seems to have genuinely fostered a high value on learning.
Definitely a factor.
Yeah.
And then there's geography. Just look at where the empire sat.
Right at the crossroads.
Exactly. Asia, Europe, Africa. Perfectly positioned to absorb ideas, trade goods, people moving through. It was a melting pot.
And you mentioned the translation movement. People like Hunan ibn Ishaq. It wasn't just word-for-word translation, was it?
No, not at all. They were grappling with complex philosophical and scientific ideas, finding the right ways to express them in Arabic, making them accessible. It was deep intellectual work. Assimilation, really.
But maybe underneath it all, the sources seem to say it was just that basic human drive to learn, to ask questions, to explore.
I think so. A society that genuinely valued and cultivated curiosity. That has to be part of it.
Okay, so with this amazing foundation built, where did all that energy go? Let's talk maths and astronomy.
Yeah, you can't really discuss this era's math without talking about Muhammad ibn Musa Al-Khwarizmi.
Right, Al-Khwarizmi. This feels like a really pivotal moment. He wasn't just solving equations, he was creating a whole system for solving them.
Precisely. His work, Al-Jab, that's where we get algebra, is revolutionary. His book, Kitab al-Jab wal Muqabala, laid out methods for linear quadratic equations.
And not just abstractly. These were tools for practical things, right? Inheritance calculations, land surveying, architecture.
Absolutely. Real-world applications. And here's the kicker connection for us today. The word algorithm.
Comes from his name, Al-Khwarizmi.
Directly from his name. It's incredible. Every time you use a search engine or your phone does anything complex, you're touching on a concept with roots right back there in 9th century Baghdad.
That's mind-blowing. And he wasn't the only one. You had others like Omar Khayyam working on cubic equations, and Al-Kindi.
Al-Kindi was crucial for introducing Indian numerals, we now call Arabic numerals, to the wider world. Much more efficient than Roman numerals, obviously.
That abstract thinking then fed directly into astronomy, didn't it? Observatories popping up.
Yes, equipped with better instruments like refined astrolabes. They were serious about observation.
Al-Batani comes up here. The research shows him correcting Ptolemy, the ancient authority figure.
Yeah, correcting Ptolemy's calculations for the solar year, measuring it with remarkable accuracy for the time. That willingness to challenge ancient wisdom based on actual observation, that's a huge scientific step.
You picture him, like the sources suggest, under the desert sky, meticulously charting stars. Not just for mystical reasons, but to understand the cosmos and improve practical things on Earth.
Timekeeping, navigation, geography.
Yeah.
It was all connected.
Okay, let's shift focus. From the stars down to the human body. Medicine. This seems like another area of huge advancement.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Especially when you contrast it with, well, some of the practices in Europe at the time, bleeding, superstition. The Islamic world's approach was becoming much more empirical, much more focused on observation and ethical care.
And the big name here is Ibn Sina, Avicenna in the West. His influence seems almost legendary.
It really was. His encyclopedia, The Canon of Medicine, 5 volumes. It just became the standard medical text, not just in the Middle East, but in Europe too, for centuries.
Like over 600 years?
Yeah, something like that. It's incredibly comprehensive. Diseases, treatments, anatomy, drugs, but also things that feel quite modern. Hygiene, diet, the role of emotions in health.
It brought everything together systematically.
Exactly. And then you had the hospitals, the Bimera stands. These sound remarkable.
Totally. Not just places you went to die. They were organized, apparently quite humane, treating rich and poor alike.
Separate wards for different diseases, keeping records. The description suggests a really patient-focused environment. Calm, trained doctors. Focus on prevention, too. It was a holistic view.
And Al-Razi rises, he stands out too, making that key distinction between smallpox and measles.
Vital diagnostic work. And he pioneered using alcohol as an antiseptic, but also his views on mental illness advocating for humane treatment. It shows this deep compassion.
Yeah, like healing was a calling, not just a trade, rooted in evidence and empathy.
That combination, the rigor, the evidence, the ethics that really made their medicines stand out.
Okay, beyond science and medicine, the cultural output was just staggering, wasn't it? Art, architecture.
Oh, absolutely. Take calligraphy. It wasn't just writing, it became this incredibly refined art form, often an act of devotion in itself.
Because there were limitations on depicting figures in some contexts.
Often, yes.
Yeah.
So that the beauty of the script itself, the flow, the structure, became a primary form of visual expression. You see it everywhere, manuscripts, buildings, objects.
And those geometric patterns, the arabesques, they're not just pretty designs.
Not at all. They're deeply mathematical, intricate, complex patterns, often symbolizing the infinite, the divine order, visual mathematics almost.
Mathematical poetry. And the architecture, those iconic domes, minarets.
Buildings like the Great Mosque of Cordoba or the Alhambra in Granada, they're breathtaking. They masterfully blend function with the sense of wonder, playing with light, space, incredible decoration.
And literature was booming too. The sources mention poets like Rumi,
whose mystical poetry still speaks to people across the world today, and Al-Mutanabbi, considered one of the giants of Arabic poetry.
It wasn't just science then. There was this deep engagement with beauty, with language.
And even music. Al-Farabi, a philosopher, also studied music's impact, its theory, its effect on the soul. It shows how broadly they define knowledge. It included rhythm, harmony, the human spirit.
Which leads us to how all this knowledge was stored and shared. Libraries. Lots of them.
Yes, not just in Baghdad. They sprang up everywhere. Cairo, Cordoba, Fez, and some were huge. That library of Al-Haytham II in Cordoba, the figure mentioned is, 400,000 books?
400,000. Before printing, that's almost impossible to imagine.
It's staggering. And a key technology enabling this was paper.
Right, invented in China, but the Islamic world really ran with it. Improved it, set up mills. Baghdad had the first one outside China, apparently.
And that was a game changer. Paper made books cheaper, easier to produce, lighter than parchment or papyrus. It democratized knowledge to a degree.
So it wasn't just locked away with the absolute elite.
Exactly. The sources try to paint that picture. Maybe a young student accessing ideas, a scholar adding notes to a translated Greek text. Knowledge wasn't static, it was flowing, being debated, built upon. It felt alive.
But as history tends to go, these golden ages don't last forever in the same form. Things change.
Yeah, that's the hard truth. The Mongol sack of Baghdad in 1258 was a massive shockwave, destroying libraries, killing scholars, ending the Abbasid Caliphate there. Devastating.
And other factors played a role over time too. Internal splits, invasions.
Internal divisions, yes. Fragmentation. Later on, the pressures of colonialism in various regions. It's complex.
And this is crucial. The knowledge itself didn't just vanish with Baghdad's libraries. It was already moving.
Precisely. It had been flowing outwards for centuries, into Europe, especially via places like Spain, Al-Andalus, and Sicily, places where cultures were intensely interacting.
Through translation again, Latin translations of these Arabic works.
Yes, texts on philosophy, math, medicine, astronomy, texts that often contain preserved Greek wisdom, plus all the new Islamic advancements were translated into Latin. This was a massive injection of knowledge into Europe.
Fueling the Renaissance later on.
It was definitely a major contributing factor. That rediscovery and expansion of knowledge provided essential groundwork.
So, Al-Khwarizmi's methods, Ibn Sina's medicine, Avicenna's star charts, they traveled, carried by that same human curiosity we talked about.
Exactly. Across borders, languages, centuries. And the legacy isn't just historical, as the sources emphasize. We still see traces.
Like the principles of the bimeristans in modern hospitals.
Or Al-Khwarizmi's logic fundamental to software. Or the enduring appeal of Rumi's poetry. The seeds planted then are still bearing fruit today, in ways you might not even realize.
No, we should add some nuance here. It wasn't a perfect utopia, right? No civilization is.
Absolutely not. The material points to real intellectual debates and tensions. You had rationalists embracing Greek philosophy, clashing with more traditionalist thinkers, like Al-Ghazali, who urged caution about reason versus revelation.
And figures like Ibn Rushd Averroes defending rational inquiry fiercely.
Right, so there were deep debates about free will, the soul, the universe. Science versus theology wasn't always an easy fit. They were wrestling with the big questions.
And socially, access wasn't totally equal, presumably.
No, while knowledge was arguably more accessible than in many contemporary societies, there were still limitations. Class, sometimes gender, social standing could still be barriers to entry in certain times and places.
But maybe seeing those debates, those tensions, it's not a sign of failure, but a sign of a society that's alive, grappling with difficult ideas.
I think that's a good way to look at it. Enlightenment isn't usually a smooth, straight road. It involves argument, pushback, complexity.
So what are the big takeaways for us now, looking back at this golden age?
Well, it's a powerful case study, isn't it? What happens when a society really leans into curiosity? When it encourages dialogue across different viewpoints? When it values exploration?
It shows that diversity wasn't just tolerated, it was an engine, a source of strength and innovation.
Yes, and that maybe we should think of knowledge itself as something precious, something to be pursued and protected. It also shows that incredible creativity can happen even when other parts of the world are facing difficulties.
It makes you think about our own time, dealing with information overload, polarization, global challenges.
Maybe there's something in that spirit of the House of Wisdom, not building one physical place, but fostering that commitment everywhere.
To open inquiry, collaboration, valuing learning.
Yeah, across all the lines that seem to divide us. Because ultimately, the real wealth of that era wasn't gold, was it?
No, the sources are clear. It was illumination.
The light of understanding, passed down through time.
So maybe the question for you, listening now, is this. If that deep human quest for truth, that willingness to engage across differences, was the powerhouse behind the Golden Age, how consciously are we cultivating that same spirit today in our own lives, in our communities, in the world?